All right. Well, Rodrigo, you are another student in the Carnivore Certification Program. Glad to have you as a part of that. You are here to once again ask me about basically the four modules that I contributed, and then some extraneous parts like about the biochemistry of the human body. And I'm here to help you with those questions as much as I can. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, I'm also looking forward to it. So, first, I want to ask a question about the calorie deficit
Yep.
because I think as carnivore coaches, I think the main concurrents would be like the typical fitness coach that would talk about like psycho.
Yep.
And so, in this regard, I think it's important to really understand or really to explain to clients what happens if they are on a so-called calorie deficit.
Okay.
So, let's say someone sees a coach that tells them to have a calorie deficit of minus 500 calories. What happens concretely to that person?
Well, so I have sort of an issue with the unit of calorie in the first place. Are you
Yeah,
saying
obviously.
when you
Yeah.
yeah, when you so here's my problem with the whole calorie thing before we really get into the question. Um, Whenever someone says to get into a calorie deficit, usually their implication is just to eat less food.
Mm,
But the problem is using that unit as the unit of measurement for food intake because the problem with it is that the example I use often, you may have heard it if you watch my channel. I'm not sure, but I've been using it recently because it finally clicked in my head whenever I saw this person doing exactly this. Paul Saladino will often say that he is animal based a lot, and I continue to be confused by this because I was like, well, even if you're going to encourage the consumption of fruit and honey to the copious amounts that you encourage it to be consumed, you can't really reasonably call it an animal-based diet, right? Like you can't call your diet an animal-based diet because the majority of the food, the actual mass of food you're consuming is fruit
mm,
and honey. Except now
yeah.
I then realized why he still calls it animal-based. It's because whenever you calculate the calories contained in all the food that he consumes, quote unquote, you're actually he's deriving the majority of his calories from animal products because they're more calorically dense.
Mm,
And so when people say to go into a calorie deficit of 500 calories, it's irrespective of the actual constituents of the food that have different hormonal effects, which actually does impact body composition. It's irrespective of the fact that it's neglecting to mention that we are an open system, which means that we not only allow for the flow of energy in and out of our bodies, but also mass. So if you eat a bunch of fiber, that contributes to caloric value, but you're excreting fiber because you don't digest it.
mm,
So that's another
yeah.
thing. And then also, first of all, there's a lot of noise around the signal when it comes to the calorie number, plus or minus 20%.
Mm.
Um, and I think there was another one that I was thinking of something else, but I've lost it at this point. There's many issues with that. So when people say to go into a caloric deficit of 500 calories, when you're asking me what the concrete effects of that on the body are, it's kind of hard to answer the question if we're using the term calories. If you are to be just simply saying or referring to the restricting mass of food intake, you're just restricting the mass of the food that you're consuming and assuming that the constituents of the food are fat and protein primarily if it's a carnivore diet, very minimal carbohydrates. Well, typically what ends up happening is you can very easily, especially if you're eating one meal a day, you're going to slow down your metabolic rate. And oftentimes that's a consequence of not stimulating enough insulin. So a lot of people say that when you go carnivore, you screw up your hormones because, oh, your metabolic rate slows down because you're not, eating carbs. Well, it's not the carbs directly that they're talking about. They're specifically talking about an insulin response. Insulin, you get higher insulin, you'll increase metabolic rate because of its effect on thyroid function.
Mhm.
So I would say that if you're going to tell someone to restrict food intake, first of all, I'd love to know the context behind why you're doing that because the number one rule, in my opinion, is eat when hungry. Even if that person decides to eat twice a day on a carnivore diet, it's really
Yeah.
number one rule is eat when hungry and make sure that you are eating sufficient protein, really just sufficient food in general for an insulin response. Because I saw recently there was another coach in the space that she made a really good point. She said, carnivore won't screw up your hormones. It doesn't disrupt your hormones, but you can undereat on any diet.
Mm.
It's like, I was like, yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of times I put a lot of emphasis on protein because it's more insulinogenic than fat. However, it could very well just be a consequence of you not eating enough food in general, whether it be protein or fat. And so I think that's the best thing to do. Your question was really revolved around in a carnivore coach scenario, if you're telling a client to restrict their calories by 500, by about 500 numerically, what would the consequences, what would the concrete effects on the body be? Was that really what the question?
No, what I had in mind is was like the other coaches, the non-carnivore coaches,
Oh, okay,
who
okay.
go the approach of oh, eat a bunch of fiber to fill up your stomach, then you won't be as hungry when you're under eating
Right, right,
because you need to under eat to lose weight, is their idea. So
right. Yeah.
what happens concretely then?
Yeah, so again, I would say usually you're going to have poor effects on metabolic rate, and not only that, typically if they're telling people to for example, to consume lots of fiber, first of all, that means including more plants, potentially more plants than they're already consuming.
Hmm,
And not only that, fiber will strip nutrition from you as well. So there's also a risk of nutritional deficiencies as well, I would think. At least that's just my opinion. Specifically soluble fiber, because it actually will sort of swell up. It'll absorb a lot of water, and with that water comes a lot of nutrition. And so you'll actually be excreting more nutrition than you're actually absorbing. So that will also be a negative impact, um, or at least a concern, a potential concern. Then, of course, the associated plant toxins, depending on your sensitivity to them, it'll increase inflammation status, which can increase water weight. So that's a problem. It can also raise your propensity to storing fat potentially because when you're inflamed, your redox potential decreases. So that's something that can also happen. But I think the most consequential element of that is the decreased metabolic rate,
mhm,
which is one of the reasons. It's actually one of the main critiques, as trite as it is. It's because it's true. It's only trite because it's true that when people try to go into a caloric deficit, usually your body compensates by slowing its metabolic rate. So even if you're going to follow the calories in, calories out model, how many calories you're consuming versus how many calories you're expending or burning,
hmm,
well, by that logic, even by that formula, if you eat less and you also subsequently your body lowers its metabolic rate, you can be at a gridlock. You get a net zero. Like you're not gonna lose any weight.
hmm.
And I've actually seen this before, particularly with my girlfriend Bella, uh, years ago. She bought into the whole calories nonsense, and she was eating oranges and ice cubes every day. And she did not budge. She felt like she was going to pass out all the time because she was nutritionally deficient. But she also was still, I mean, she's 5'1", and she was 170 pounds or something like that. I mean, it's quite a bit of weight on her. I don't know. I know that you're in a different country, so you might use different
Yeah,
units.
I'm dividing by two to get
Yeah, yeah,
kilograms.
yeah, yeah. So you're yeah, kilograms. Yeah, yeah. So no, it's a problem, and it would be great if you could just increase metabolic rate, which even according to the calories in, calories out model, even if you're going to use that, would actually be more conducive to losing weight because you'd be increasing metabolic rate and expending more calories, right? Despite
Hmm,
the fact that you could be eating the same amount of food or same calories, quote unquote, but with different food to do so. You know what I mean?
hmm.
So
Yeah.
there's many reasons why the calories in, calories out model is just not. I mean, it's almost unethical at this point, especially given how much evidence against it there is. Like it's like a flagrant sort of perverse way of just continuing to do what you're doing, despite the fact that you know it's wrong. Lane Norton is a perfect example of this, frankly. Like I'm
Hmm.
not gonna, anyway, I don't want to take up too much time in the consultation spending that on one question, but I hope that
Yeah.
that helped. I mean, if you need more details or want more details, you feel free to ask. But
No, that was a good answer. So, the other thing I was wondering is, so we talked about in the module about vitamin C, and I
yep.
was also wondering about the other nutrients, because obviously vitamin C is one that comes a lot, but also like I saw, I don't know if you saw this guy, but he like has an app and he puts the everything that people eat in a day, like in the what I eat
Hmm.
in a day video,
Yeah.
and then he calculates the nutrient intake, and he did that for like carnivore Ray,
Yeah.
and he
I
got
believe that you're referring to Obi Fitness using Chronometer. You
no,
may be
it's
referring to
another
someone else.
one. It's
Okay.
another guy with a mustache. He looks
Oh,
super
okay,
goofy.
okay, interesting. Okay, okay.
Anyway, so yeah, and it's funny because they always like to add up things, but never subtract like the from the anti-nutrients or divide from the
Yes,
availability.
yes.
Anyway, so what I saw come up was like K1,
Yeah,
mineral like
yeah.
potassium and I think others, selenium, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And um yeah, also they like to like remove all of the fat soluble vitamins, like as if carnivores eat only lean meat. It's very
Yeah.
strange.
Yep.
So maybe do you know why where that comes from? Why do like the apps or the like the authorities like give no minerals and other fat soluble vitamins to meat?
Yeah, I'm not completely sure how they make those measurements. I know that those apps are specifically based on the RDAs and RDIs, but I think your question is what are the RDIs and RDAs based on, basically? Like, what are
Yeah,
they?
how did they come to this conclusion?
Yeah, that is something I have to look into. Frankly, I think I've heard that whenever they were observing certain foods to measure, like the yeah, that's actually a separate question, which is what foods were they using to determine how much on average of a certain vitamin or mineral is actually in the food? Because that matter. So that's a good question because a lot of these apps, I think I've seen that their vitamin C content for red meat, they'll put like 0% or something, and it's a percentage of your daily intake. So, or your not daily intake, but your recommended daily intake. And
Mm,
so I don't know the exact foods that they use, or I don't even know when these were, how often they've been changed, if they've been changed at all, like when the last time they were changed. But all of that does matter because here's the thing about the RDAs and the RDIs. There's a question I ask all the time, and it's according to who on the basis of what? Because you have to look at the population that was studied to determine what the requirements are for certain nutrients. You have to know what the methods were for employing it. Like it's not enough to be like, well, this is your recommended daily intake because these are your requirements. It's like,
mm,
well, my requirements are going to be up or down for certain nutrients depending on what I'm doing and what I'm eating and who I am genotypically and phenotypically. So it's like you can't really give that as how much noise is around that signal. And so the thing about RDAs and RDIs is I almost think it's a waste of time to even try and determine how much vitamin C or whatever mineral or whatever nutrient you're referring to is required on a general basis. I think that people underestimate how much even today, even in today's world, in the era of material science and technological revolution, we still rely on trial and error. In order to determine whether a diet is sufficient, you are going to have to study a population, a very large population, over the course of a long period of time, a long enough period of time for people to develop nutritional deficiencies, and observe, basically do a prospective cohort study between the population that you're studying, the carnivore population in this case, or a carnivore population, and compare that to a standard population and multiple different populations eating different diets, and then compare whether they're symptomatic or not, because that's really the main
yeah,
criterion for a nutritional deficiency. It's not whether or not you meet the RDAs or the RDIs. It's whether or not you're actually symptomatic of something that is indicative of a nutritional deficiency.
yeah,
We do this with the thyroid issues, for example. Like, oh, are you getting enough protein? A lot of people go, well, how much protein do I need to stimulate sufficient insulin? I go, well, that's usually based on experience because if you start developing symptoms like muscle cramping, electrolyte issues, and being cold all the time, all indicative of a lower metabolic rate, which is indicative of poor thyroid function, which is again insulin related. Well, that's a sign. It's based on symptoms, and
mm,
that's because of the Hippocratic Oath that says basically if you're a clinician, do no harm, but the implications there are mainly you are obligated to not intervene with a patient or with patients in circumstances where they do not present with any disease process, with any symptoms of any kind. Like you cannot do that, responsibly speaking. And so, yeah, I believe that in terms of determining whether or not a carnivore diet is deficient in nutrition, there are going to need to be studies done that have not been done yet, that need to be conducted properly and responsibly, that show bona fide deficiencies develop on a carnivore diet. And then you'd have to see, in the cases where the deficiencies do develop, what the diet was consisting of and what else these people were doing. Because a carnivore diet can also be beef jerky and milk, and I don't recommend people do that because you probably will become deficient. It's like you have to make sure that you have enough variety, so to speak. I know that, I'm not saying need a balanced diet per se, right? But you know what I mean, with the variety to actually get adequate nutrition from your foods. Nutrition with Judy has said this before. If people are genuinely concerned about getting deficiencies on a carnivore diet that consists of primarily ruminant meat, you have many other options to choose from that are still carnivore friendly. Like you can choose variety within the carnivore diet that can supply you with adequate nutrition. So yes, your question about how do these apps really determine like what were these RDAs and RDIs based on? What were these percentages based on when they say things like, oh, red meat's going to give you this percentage of vitamin C? I mean, according to what? I don't know the specifics on what food was studied. And I also don't know the specifics on how the RDAs and RDIs were determined. However, I've heard that they were actually multiplied by like two or three just for safety too, which is also a problem. Just in case, right? Um, People can fact check me on that if that's incorrect. But yeah, but that leads into a conversation of how to even determine what's necessary in the first place, and that's why I just gave that whole spiel. That wasn't exactly tangential. It's important to clarify whenever we talk about anything, saying anything about percentage daily value, or claiming that things are deficient. It's like, prove that it's deficient. An app told you that. The question
Yeah.
always is according to who on the basis of what? Are these people symptomatic? The only symptom that I really see on carnivore is the whole insulin problem thing, and we know the solution to that. So,
Yeah, I think it's funny how these bots like the YouTubers, but they really act like bots. They review like the videos. They see a
yeah.
person who has been eating carnivore for like 1 year and obviously still alive, and oh, you have zero vitamin C.
Right. And it's like, well, if that were the case, then all these
Yeah,
carnivores would be coming down with scurvy all the time. And then what
yeah,
they'll
yeah,
do
yeah.
to prove that they come down with scurvy is point to an N of one case of someone consuming only dairy or something, or canned beef. That happened, which
Yeah.
vitamin C degrades over months of storage. So there you go. If the person's eating only stored canned meat, then there you go. There's a problem. So yeah, yeah.
And
By the way,
also,
sorry, one more thing. You touched on
yeah,
K1. K1 was mentioned.
yeah.
K1 is not the bioavailable form of vitamin K. It's K2, which is
Mm.
plentiful in meat. So there's something there.
Yeah, so K2 is basically like superior to K1, right?
Yeah, it is. And in fact, yeah, so K1 has to actually be converted in the body.
Yeah. Okay,
And
that's
so,
that's what I heard, but I wanted to make sure.
yep.
Um, and also about the symptoms. So I'm wondering, like, are like what kind of symptoms do people generally have on a standard diet? Because I feel like a standard diet um will should be nutritionally deficient. I'm guessing so, with all of what I've learned. And so I'm guessing I'm thinking what are the concrete symptoms that people experience and might not take too seriously and like think that it's normal when it's actually a symptom of deficiency.
Well, it's hard to pin down specifics because they're doing a lot of other things too. They're eating a lot of other things. However, I think there's a emergency medical doctor in India right now that's performing studies on this, and it seems like B12 is actually a big one, even in omnivores. So even in people with a standard diet, they seem to have B12 deficiencies. And again, if we're going to be logically consistent, you must ask the question, at least, in your head unconsciously, which is according to who on the basis of what, what do you
Mm,
mean deficient, right? But um, even according to the guidelines, they want to say, you get deficient on B12 if you go on I've actually heard the argument that you'll get B12 deficient on carnivore, which is odd. But you also get B12 deficient on an omnivore diet. At least it's possible.
mm.
B12 is one that I'm aware of. Um, Again, it's really hard to pin down specifics because I'll tell you what, I mean, it seems like a lot of people are vitamin D deficient. However, That really has nothing to do with diet per se. That really has to do with sunlight exposure.
Mm,
Um, I've heard that there's a possibility that creatine is a big one, even in people with a standard diet that are eating meat. And that is really seen in how people respond to creatine supplementation that are eating a standard diet. They'll be like, wow, I'm like, more explosive in the gym. And it makes sense on a chemical basis because creatine is important in the energy, supplying energy to the muscle, the fibers to actually contract. But again, yeah, that's me just trying to desperately find some. I don't know the specifics about that. I really don't. All I know is because I mainly focus on the stuff that's in the diet on a standard diet that's just not something that you should be consuming. Naturally, what happens, Anthony Chafee has talked about this before. He thinks that all disease can be traced back to species inappropriate diet, which includes things that are toxic, so excess toxins, but also insufficient nutrition. Typically, what happens though is whenever you go to a carnivore diet, you're not just removing the toxins and all that stuff and removing carbohydrates and stuff like that. You're also adding nutrition in. So the
mm,
symptoms that people develop or the fixes that they have for their conditions, the ameliorations, could very well not only be due to them removing the toxins, it very well could also just be the fact that they're getting adequate, and not only adequate, but bioavailable nutrition, which is really a measure of adequate, right? Because it
mm.
doesn't matter how much calcium you're consuming from spinach, if all of it's bound to oxalate, you're just going to excrete it, right? So, as much as meat has far less calcium than plants like spinach do, it's like, well, are you absorbing more of it? Because that's what matters. So,
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, I wish that I could do a better job of answering that, but I don't think there's too many specifics on nutrient deficiencies, at least that I'm aware of, on an omnivorous diet, and that's not particularly something I focus on, although it is a good question because then it's another way of saying, hey, you think that being on a balanced diet is a great thing, and it gets you everything that you need because it's all balanced. But how balanced is it if you come down with deficiencies according to what you believe a deficiency is, like where you believe the cutoff point is, because they also all believe in the medical guidelines. Like,
Yeah.
oh, well, So anyway, yeah, I wish that's a good question. I should write it down and figure that out for you.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the RDAs are like a Bible for many people. It's
Yeah.
like no questions asked.
Yep.
Um, yeah, maybe so on the subject of vitamin D and sunlight exposure.
Yeah.
To what extent should we expose ourselves to sunlight? And because like in my case, it's mid-May and I already have a tan. Like
Yep.
I'm in winter, I have the same skin color as you, but
Yeah.
uh, I've been doing my ho homework.
Yeah.
But also like last summer here, I got like a bunch of little spots, and I'm wondering like um, how much sun exposure would be too much. And also, I've heard that sunglasses can be a bad idea
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
for like the eye receptors.
So with sunglasses, you're referring to a blunting of the stimulation of melanin stimulating hormone, which is stimulated once photons of light react with your retina. And
Hmm.
so the idea there is that if you are wearing sunglasses out in the sun, even if it doesn't eliminate the stimulation of melanin stimulating hormone, it can blunt it significantly depending on who you are. And melanin stimulating hormone allows your skin to be more protected from the sun. Because as much as a lot of people in the space will say, well, sunlight doesn't cause, you know, skin damage, it's an inflammatory diet. It's both things. They both play a factor. The sun absolutely has the capacity to actually cause DNA damage in the mitochondria. It does. But your propensity for developing that is going to be far lower if you're less inflamed. I mean,
Yeah,
of course, that's the case. It's like nature versus nurture. Both play a role. They're not exclusively the cause of anything, right? But they both work synergistically. So same thing with this. Um, in terms of so with the sunglasses, that's why I recommend at least, if you have to use them when you're driving or something, well,
yeah,
obviously wear them. But if you're going to actually get out in the sun for the sake of getting out in the sun, if you want more protection on your skin, you don't want to burn as easily, you may consider not wearing sunglasses. That's why I say that. In terms of how much is too much, that's going to be very individual. That's going to be on a very individual basis. I would always say that if you're not familiar with going out in the sun, don't sit out there for 3 hours. In fact, 30 minutes may actually be too much for you. For me, with someone that has extremely pale skin that does not get enough sunlight because of where we are right now, that'll change soon as is convenient. Um, the the problem with me is I can actually go to like Florida. I'll go in the sun on the beach in Florida for 20 minutes, and I will know that I'm going to be burnt for like a week. And
Mm,
so for me, I have to incrementally go like, okay, 20 minutes, okay, 30 minutes next time once the burn heals, okay, 40 minutes. There was a point where I was getting hours of sunlight and I had a tan, but I wasn't burning. And so it's just an incremental sort of increase. And according to what your body can withstand, I think that, making sure not to go over that. Like if you know that no matter what you do, no matter how adapted you get, you can't stay out in the direct sun for 6 hours or so, well, then don't do it. I mean, experience, trial and error is going to be your compass there. It's going to be your navigator. Um, but once again, what seems to happen is people have a lower propensity to develop a sunburn, develop damaged skin, like a burn, um, from the sun if they remove a lot of the inflammatory compounds from their diet. And that's what I think getting sun is very important. You want to maximize the amount of sunlight exposure that you can get within the confines of, within the limits of burning, right? You don't want to burn. That's actually not, I mean, you don't want to burn too much, let's say that. Okay, because you
yeah,
have to you have to burn slightly to sort of like get your body used to, to stimulate the tan, but you don't want to burn yourself to a crisp and have a sunburn that makes it to where you
yeah.
can't even move your neck or turn your head without it
Mm.
being extremely painful. So, yeah, that's not a great idea.
Yeah, last year I think I I kind of overestimated the sun resistance from not eating poison,
Yeah.
and I got a very bad sunburn.
Yep. I did that last year, I think. Going to Florida. I think it was during the winter time. And so we went to Florida and it was like, wow, this is great because it's like 80 degrees outside and sunny. Because it's like that always in Florida. And I we stayed out there for about like 2 hours or so in the ocean too. So that makes it even harder to actually tell if you're getting burned or not. If you're in
Mm.
water
Yeah, yeah.
and I was bedridden for 2 days. I hadn't been that sunburnt in a long time. That was a lot of pain that I was in because it was just after I'd gotten treatment too, which is very intensive. My treatment is very intensive for EDS and all that stuff. And no, I didn't move for like 2 days. I couldn't move. It was very bad. So no, I understand. I understand.
Yeah, I went to Florida also, but it was in summer, so it was like the ocean was uh as hot as the air, so it was not so
Oh, okay, okay, yeah, yeah. So you probably didn't want to
advantage.
go in there that well. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so now yeah, maybe I wanted to ask like some specific questions about the rental cycle.
Okay. Yep.
So if you take so yeah, one case that is often spoken about like by Barkay, like on the side of uh like high carb and low to no fat is like the vegan diet,
Yeah.
but some of them do like their olive oil and stuff like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
But also the gym bro diet, as I like to call it, where they use like the spray
Yep.
to have as little oil as possible, and then they have like chicken rice. So I'm wondering, for these people that have maybe like 20 grams of fat and maybe 200 grams of carbohydrates, what happens? Like, does the fat get into the cells? I mean, yeah, it does, but like, does it get converted a bit to ATP or like basically none at all because of the high carbohydrates?
Yeah, it's hard to I mean, you'd have to actually do some sort of like nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy or something like that where you actually observe what's going on in the cell at that time to know. Um, my feeling though is that most of it would actually be used to be stored. And
Hmm.
reason for that. So there's this myth that fat makes you fat because whatever fat you eat is stored. Well, the philosophy behind that has to do with the Randall cycle. If your cells are oxidizing glucose, and really when we say oxidizing glucose, it's pyruvate technically, but I mean, for the sake of the argument, for simplicity's sake, you're oxidizing glucose. You, Glucose is going into the cells, it's being used to create ATP, aerobically speaking. The fat will be blocked from the mitochondria. So it'll go into the cell. It'll also go into the cell, but basically there's a roadblock that it can't get into the mitochondria. So it's pooling in the cell, and you can actually see this under a microscope with fatty droplets. Um, but the fat doesn't just sit there. If the body is dealing with pooling fat, it's going to do something with it. And a lot of the glucose that flows in, there's an intermediate step in the glycolysis pathway where it can be converted into glycerol and then glycerol 3 really glycerol 3 phosphate actually, and that's what's used to basically function as the backbone for triglycerides. So those fatty acids that are pooling in the cell will then bind to that molecule and it'll form a triglyceride. And it will be stored in whatever cell we're talking about here. So we could be talking about a muscle cell, we could be talking about a fat cell, we could even really be talking about a liver cell. However, the liver doesn't usually oxidize glucose to any significant degree, even in high blood glucose scenarios, which is actually a sign that maybe we shouldn't be consuming so much glucose because the liver is clearly not prepared to be doing that, even in hyperglycemic events. So if you're talking about 20 grams of fat, and you're eating 200 grams of carbohydrates, your body is definitely, especially if it's on a daily basis, your body's definitely much more proficient at oxidizing the glucose than it is at oxidizing the fat. So there's also less expression of the enzymes involved in even creating using fat to create energy in the first place. So
Hmm.
there's that, but then also even without that, most of the fat's going to be pooling in the cell. And so then it will be used to create fat. So that's where the myth comes from. If you turn your body into a it, they usually if you turn your body into a machine that is actually adept and more proficient at oxidizing fat, different story. Then if you're having 20 grams of fat and you decide to have 200 grams of carbohydrates with it, well, your body is probably going to use the 20 grams of fat for energy production, and the 200 grams of carbohydrates are going to be trying to get into the cells, but you're going to have a glucose spike and it's going to hold for a minute.
Hmm.
And that's a Randall cycle situation. It's also because of a downregulation on GLUT transporters on your pancreas, on your muscle cells, on your fat cells, on every cell, because you're not consuming it. Why would your body have a higher expression of GLUT transporters if you're not consuming lots of carbohydrates? Your tolerance for carbohydrates will go down if you cut carbohydrates out of your diet. That does not mean that you should be consuming a bunch of carbohydrates regularly because, oh, my tolerance has gone down for it. You know what I mean? I know that's
Hmm.
not exactly what you're talking about. This is for other viewers as well. They're thinking.
Yeah,
So,
obviously.
yeah,
Yeah.
I wanted to throw that out there because there's a lot of people there's this sugar diet going around. Sugar diet. I don't know if you've even heard about it, but people are saying like to go on sugar fast and eat a bunch of candy and like 700 to 1,000 grams of carbohydrates and cut your fat super low, and you'll have energy for days. This is like Cole Robinson type stuff. Mark Bell has been talking about this too. But Cole Robinson is this influencer who's been saying stuff like that. He's been saying things like, when you go on a low carb diet, you're not fixing the diabetes issue. You're not fixing the insulin resistance, the underlying cause. Because if you test these people, you do a glucose tolerance test on these people, their glucose levels rise and they hold. And I go, well, yes, that's what happens when you don't consume carbs for months on end.
Hmm.
That's supposed to happen. And then guess what? You do it for like 2 days, and your body it starts to express it starts to become proficient at oxidizing carbs again.
Hmm.
What do you know? So anyway, yeah.
And so for this group of people who have very little fat, but maybe they'll have a lot of meat and get a lot of nutrient from it. But without the fat, they're probably gonna have issues with fat soluble vitamins, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Not only that, they'll actually, if anything, they'll have a problem with glucose regulation as well. Pr Protein's insulinogenic effect, its effect on insulin secretion is highly dependent on the underlying glycemic status, the underlying blood sugar level. So what this means is that if you were to consume if you're to consume a bolus of protein, like a pretty healthy bolus of protein, and you're a carnivore, your insulin level, your insulin to glucagon ratio, actually, the ratio between the two, think of it like yin and yang, you know,
Hmm.
can actually drop. So you'll actually enter a more catabolic state oftentimes if you consume like protein in a fasted ketogenic state. But in people that are on a standard diet, um, you can consume protein, administered into these people, and their IgG ratio will go from like 4 in the fed state to like 70. And it's because of the fact that they can afford to have a higher insulin level because they've consumed carbs. In a ketogenic person, if their insulin rises too high, their gluconeogenesis will shut down. It'll be inhibited more and more, and then they'll go into hypoglycemia. So the body has ways to counteract that. It's like, no, we can't do that. We'll raise glucagon, but we're not gonna raise our insulin too high. And so that's another thing that can happen. If they're eating lots of carbs, no fat, but they're also eating protein, they could very well have a insulin issue. So I said blood sugar issue. I shouldn't have said that. They could have higher insulin and they could actually be storing more fat than if they otherwise had low protein.
Hmm.
But most of these people are also consuming low protein. So I guess they're off the hook in that case, in that sense. So
Yeah. And yeah, also for the like let's say a carnivore that slips up and has like a bunch of ice cream. Um Obviously that's gonna be pulling at the blood. So what is the best way to deal with that? So I'm guessing doing a bit of like is would exercise be effective to use the glucose or would it not be able to use it that well?
it could be. However, your body also recycles a lot of the glucose that it uses for muscle contractions in the form of lactate. So I'd be curious to know how much of it would actually just be used versus how much of it would still be pooling because the body's recycling glucose. I genuinely don't know. Typically, what ends up happening is it holds for a while and then the insulin rises enough to finally get it back down. But whenever it gets it down, the cells shift over to using the glucose for ATP production. So you've basically done a gear shift over to glycolysis. And so that's actually a good question. I think exercise could very well help it, yes. But again, my brain is immediately going to how much that glucose is actually just going to be brought down from the blood because it's being used versus how much of it is actually not going to be used at all. It's still going to remain high in the blood even during exercise because a lot of it's being recycled again and again. Does that
Hmm.
make sense? Yeah, because once again, like right now, as I move my arms and all this stuff and my face muscles and all this, there is glucose, there's glycogen in the form of glycogen being basically think of it like the cell is those cartoon animations of like the cartoon characters eating a corn on the cob and the kernels the kernels shoot past their face or something like they're eating it super
Hmm.
fast. Okay, that's what the cell does with glycogen to cause the muscle contraction. But all those little corn kernels, all the glucose there really is pyruvate. It will be converted into lactate, exported from the cell, go to the liver to create glucose again, and then go back in the blood. And it just is a circle. It's called the Cori cycle. So, how much of that glucose in that situation is going to be recycled versus how much of it is actually going to be used? That's the question that I have. I think that even exercise won't be enough to bring the glucose down at least super fast. It may eventually, but I don't think it necessarily has to do with the fact that the muscles are using glucose. I think it's the fact that the mitochondria would eventually cause a gear shift over to glycolysis and start using glucose to create ATP, and the fat would be doing something else. The fat would stop being oxidized. The fat would be the thing stored. So I don't know. It's a complicated process. The Randall cycle, Cori cycle, all that stuff. It's complicated, but that's where my brain is going. I think that exercise can help, but maybe not to the degree that we think it can if you are someone that is ketogenic, fat adapted, and you have a bunch of ice cream or something. Which, by the way, since it has fat in it, is also going to slow the absorption of glucose. So that also has a role to play. It's not going to be where it spikes your glucose per se. Maybe a slow sort of introduction into the bloodstream. So there's
Hmm.
a lot of variables at play, a lot of factors.
All right. And now On another topic, I wanted to ask about like the extra virgin oils, because so obviously the seed oils are bad, but how about the very bitter ones? I don't know why you would have that, but maybe many people think they are healthy because they are bitter. So
Hmm.
that haven't been heated in the factory to produce them. So how how unoptimal are they in comparison to butter or beef tallow?
Yeah, so there's pros and cons to those oils. I'm definitely not going to sit here and say that they are in any way equivalent to seed oils, because as you just mentioned, the high heat and pressure that's employed in the production of seed oils is not the case with actual genuine cold pressed extra virgin oils like olive oil, like you're talking about. So that's not an issue with those. The main issue with seed oils is actually the oxidation products from those
Mm,
processes. So those aren't going to be in olive oil. Those aren't going to be in things like coconut oil, which I know is not necessarily exactly what you were referring to, but it's sort of similar in that respect because it's from a plant. Um, the main problems that I have with olive oils, first of all, there is still a relatively significant degree of polyunsaturated fatty acids in those oils, even if they're not oxidized. And we know that according to, every record available to us, anthropologically and all that stuff, the amount of polyunsaturated fats that we were eating as a species is very low, because if we're getting most of it from animal products.
mm,
And so that could be a problem with respect to cellular integrity because you start eating a lot of polyunsaturates, then they can be incorporated into your cell membranes and they make them less fluid. So that's a worry, and they have a half-life of like in some cases, depending on the study you're looking at, like 4 years, or sorry, 2 years, because then it could take 4 full years to actually get them out of your cell membranes. Um, so there is that, but also um, you mentioned the bitterness of those
mm.
oils. The bitterness
Yeah.
typically comes from polyphenols, and there's a lot of people thinking that polyphenols are like this magical compound in plants that are like the best antioxidants, the most anti-aging compounds of all time. Um, Polyphenols are bitter for a reason. They are a plant defense chemical. So I wouldn't recommend consuming plant defense chemicals,
Yeah.
especially considering there's no requirement for them. I'm not going to sit here and say that since it's a plant defense chemical, that if you have just a little bit of it, commensurate with the amount you have, you're going to develop symptoms and all this stuff. People have different tolerances for different things. So, in terms of the sheer amount of plant toxins in olive oil, those fats, I'm not aware of anything else except polyphenols, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's anything else in there. What we know is that the most appropriate, species appropriate fat for our species is animal fat, which does have a healthy amount of monounsaturated fats, to be fair. That's actually the most common fat in animal products, is monounsaturated, then saturated fat, with very minimal polyunsaturated fats. So, yes, in terms of ranking them, polyunsaturated fat, like the polyunsaturated oils, the industrial seed oils, very bad. There's nothing that really tops it. Okay, I'd rather someone have 100 grams of carbohydrates a day than consume a significant amount of those oils. I will be the first to say that. And then the fruit oils are pretty down on the list in terms of plant toxicity and like, lack of indication in the diet, the problematic rating, so to speak, at least in my opinion. And then the safest ones are going to be the animal fats. So, yes, someone can incorporate them, but I wouldn't put too much emphasis on having them in the diet.
And why exactly is the monounsaturated fat better than the pure fat?
Well, the reason I say that is not based on any human nutrition science. It's actually based on how frequently we were encountering it ancestrally speaking. Since we were eating
Okay.
primarily animal products, and animal products primarily have monounsaturated fat in them, as more than any other fat, actually, then that's why I say, well, I mean, might as well say that we have more of a what's the word? It has more of an indication in our diet than polyunsaturates would to any significant degree.
Hmm.
In terms of like what our body's able to oxidize, it can oxidize all fats technically for energy production. It just requires different enzymes. But the thing with polyunsaturates as well, here's another reason why monounsaturates are on a chemical basis actually safer It's because polyunsaturated fats are more prone to oxidation in the body. And by oxidation, I mean like peroxidation in the
Mm.
body. Because since they have multiple double carbon bonds, they have a higher propensity for one of the carbons to be basically twist around one of the other carbons and form a trans fat. Monounsaturates don't because they only have one double bond. And so, the chances of it getting peroxidized in the body are much lower than the polyunsaturates. However, there is
Mm.
some nuance there because it depends on how much you're consuming. Like if you're consuming a lot of monounsaturated fats but very little polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats may be far more likely on an individual basis to be peroxidized than polyunsaturated fats, but
Yeah.
you're also eating a lot more, so maybe more is happening. But again, that's why we always go back as much as because of so much nuance, we always go back to what were we most commonly, most regularly consuming on a regular basis. It seems to be monounsaturated fat, then saturated, then polyunsaturated, and it's not even close. Very little. So that's why I say that.
All right.
Yeah.
And then I'm so we talked about like differences within the unsaturated saturated fats, and
Mhm.
I'm also wondering about the like the length of the fatty acid chain.
Yep.
So we saw that the long fatty acids are very efficient for ATP production, and how about the other like short chain, medium chain?
Mhm.
Do they also have this four step, was it, process?
Yes, they do. However, it's slightly different. So short chain fatty acids, they enter basically directly into the cell via passive diffusion like all these other fats do. So no hormone is involved. They just can go directly into the cell because a fat is going into something that is fat soluble. It's a fat
Yeah.
soluble, and your cells are made of fat, so it doesn't require any facilitator or anything like that. But then, usually with long chain fatty acids, which are the ones it's the prototypical fat, they will go through this transporter called CPT1 on the mitochondrial membranes, on the outer mitochondrial membranes. With short chain fatty acids, they completely bypass that. They are not carnitine dependent. So they can go directly into the mitochondria and start the four-step process of just being broken down into um, ATP, basically. Really acetyl-CoA, and then goes to the Krebs cycle and then whatever. Okay.
Mhm.
So that is the case for short chain fatty acids. They obviously, since the chains are shorter, like the lengths of them are shorter, I think it's between 2 and 6 chains are short chain fatty acids, they will produce less ATP per unit. Um,
All right,
that's
yeah.
that's yeah. So because here's the thing. Let's say that you have a 16 carbon chain fat, like palmitic acid is a saturated fat. It's 16 carbons long. It goes through the four-step process of beta oxidation, and it produces the last step of beta oxidation involves the cutting of the fatty acid into two separate parts, basically by a certain enzyme. I think it's beta ketothiolase or something like that. And it breaks them into two parts. One of the molecules is acetyl-CoA, which will then go to form energy. But the other one is another uh, fatty acid, but it's 2 chains shorter than what you started with. And then it starts the process again. And then it's 12 chains. Then it's 10 chains. Then it's 8. It actually goes through the process over and over and over again. So since
Mhm.
short chain fatty acids are 2 to 6 chains long, let's say it's 4 chains. You have a 4 chain fatty acid that goes into the mitochondria. It'll produce 2 acetyl-CoA units because it'll be cut in half, basically. It'll be a 4 chain molecule, and it'll be cut in half. One's acetyl-CoA, and then instead of forming another fatty acid, since it's already 2 chains long, it just converts it to another acetyl-CoA, and then you basically create ATP that way. So anyway, yeah. So when it comes to short chain fatty acids, they enter directly into the mitochondria. I think it's the exact same for medium chain triglycerides, which have medium chain fatty acids attached. Medium chain triglycerides are called medium chain triglycerides because they never exist in isolation as their individual fatty acids. They are on a backbone with 3 fatty acids attached. In the small intestine, they will be broken apart into individual fatty acids, and then they will do the same process that the short chain fatty acids do. I don't think they are carnitine dependent either. They may be. You know what? No, no. The medium chain fats actually go to the liver, and so that's
Mm.
why you may have heard people will say it's high in this thing is high in MCTs, which means that it's uh it's really proficient. They immediately are converted into ketones. Like they're far more readily converted into ketones. It's because they migrate directly to the liver to be used through beta oxidation, and then the liver, when it's undergoing lots of beta oxidation, converts the fat not into um, ATP, but actually into ketones. So with the
Mm.
notion being that, ketones are the preferred, it's a very great, efficient fuel source and very safe and, reduces oxidative stress and all that stuff. Um, fun fact, MCTs stand for medium chain triglyceride. And the MCTs actually, when they're broken apart in the small intestine, they go to the liver, but they go through a transporter called MCT. But it does not stand
Ah,
for medium chain triglyceride. It stands
yeah,
for monocarboxylate transporter. So it's like really funny that they're both.
yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Um, all right. And I think now I only have a last question.
Okay. Sounds good.
Um, which is how do we know where did we get the number of 1.75 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass?
Okay, yes. So that is basically you're it's good that you're asking according to who on the basis of what, basically.
Yes.
Um it's but frankly, I was basing that off of a recommendation that Bart K has been using for a long time with his clients. That did not come from me specifically. I will be extremely honest with
Yeah.
you. It seems to be the case that that is sufficient protein for one's needs if they are going to, if they don't trust their appetite. Like, for example, you can have appetite dysregulation based on poor eating behaviors in the past. It is not based on anything hard that I'm aware of. That would actually be a more appropriate question for Bart himself, believe it or not. I've asked him about it and I said, okay, well, so frankly, I know how muscles work a lot and I understand how that stuff works, but he actually trained as an exercise physiologist and he dealt with clients in that regard. And he studied that
Mhm.
far more extensively than I have. So I decided to trust his judgment on that, if that makes sense. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, as much as I pretend to know everything on my channel, right? I don't. I don't know everything, and I don't pretend to. But yeah, that's. I will say I don't. The first number one rule is actually not that numerical figure. It is um, eating until satiety.
Yeah.
If that doesn't seem to be enough, then that figure may very well help you, and that's what I typically say. So
Mhm.
I wish that I could give a more exact answer. I would be able to if slash when I'm actually able to perform studies on my own. That is one of my
Mhm.
goals. I want to actually be a scientist so that I can answer these questions myself. Because frankly, I have a lot of I'm pretty jaded against the science and most of the scientists in the space. Like most of the science papers I see, I'm like, I wouldn't have done it that way. Um, how do I know to trust this in any way, shape, or form? I have more questions than answers. It'd be a lot better if I could do my own studies and be like, guys, this is what I saw, and I could do it my way, right? Like I've
Mhm.
been so jaded, I've lost so much trust that I'm like, I might as well screw it, I'll do it myself. That's kind of how I view things. Like, but unfortunately, I can't do that right now. And so eventually, maybe later in the line in a few years, I'll have a different figure. But right now, I'm basing it off of the most credible figures that I am aware of. And so that's where I got that number from.
Mhm. Because I saw a bunch of influencers citing papers which have an experimental protocol where they give a bunch of people a certain amount of protein and measure muscle growth. And then they say, oh, after I think one I saw was 1.62 grams per
Mm,
kilogram,
okay.
there was no significant increase. So I'm wondering, is that a good methodology? Because I'm thinking, well, aren't protein involved in other things than just muscle building? So I'm
Yeah,
wondering if
exactly. Exactly.
yeah, so I'm wondering if these experiments get a lower number than bar K because they don't take these other things into account.
That may very well be the case. It also is going to depend on the training stimulus applied because it also depends on how damaged the muscles are. How much protein do they need in the first place? That all
Hmm.
matters. I think that's a big thing to control for. You need to control for that because you can really destroy your muscles during a workout. And obviously, I'm being hyperbolic when I say that. And then you may actually have a higher absorption rate of protein given us the identical bolus than you would if you had done like, you know, I don't know, you didn't train to failure. You did like 80% to failure or something like that, right? I think you understand what I'm saying. Yeah.
Hmm. All
So
right.
that's what I would say to that. And frankly, I think that the difference between 1.62 and 1.75 is quite trivial anyway, because like you
Yeah.
said, there's also other ways that protein is involved in. There's things like insulin secretion, for example. And so it could actually
Mm,
function as a different benefit, not just muscle building, but also, to stimulate sufficient protein for anabolism, if that makes sense.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also on the topic of anabolism, there's something I didn't quite understand is that so when you eat a big bolus of protein, you also have like glucagon raise, so the ratio is
Yeah.
like there's more, even more glucagon than insulin,
Yep.
but then so you'd still get the like the yeah the benefits of being in anabolic state, so I didn't quite understand that
Yeah.
one.
This is something that I've touched on a few months ago, actually. When it comes to stimulating sufficient anabolic activity for like thyroid function, electrolyte maintenance, and all this stuff, the I to G ratio is actually not relevant. It's the absolute
Ah,
level of insulin. The
okay.
reason for that is because there are no glucagon receptors. Glucagon is not involved. It doesn't have an influence over the production of thyroid hormones, nor does it have an influence over the amount of electrolytes actually maintained in the body. So what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is, let's say you have an I to G ratio that's like, and I'm just going to throw random numbers out there that aren't even realistic, but it gets the point across. Let's say you have a ratio of about 3 to 5. Okay, so that's about a 60% ratio, I to G ratio. Okay, now you eat a bunch of protein, and that ratio goes up to, I don't know, 6 to 12. So now the ratio has gone down 10%. It's 50%. However, your absolute level of insulin doubled, which means that in terms of thyroid function and electrolyte maintenance, that may very well actually have an effect on keeping those maintained, despite the fact that you are not in an anabolic episode. You're in a more catabolic episode, but you still have provided the body sufficient insulin to build thyroid hormone for thyroid hormone production and conversion, T4 to T3, and also maintenance of electrolytes at the level of the kidneys. I don't know if that makes sense. The only time that the I to G ratio needs to be considered is if the system that you are considering is influenced by insulin and glucagon. So
Mm,
if it isn't influenced by like if it's not if something's influenced by glucagon but not insulin, well, you only need to look at the absolute level of glucagon to understand to infer whether or not sufficient a certain level of glucagon may or may not be sufficient to stimulating a certain process or inhibiting a certain process depending on what that process is. So that's what I would say about that. But unfortunately, I am out of time because I've got another interview to do. But this was I hope that I answered all your questions to the best of my abilities and increased your understanding of these things.
yeah, that was really the last thing on my mind, so that's perfect.
All right, awesome. Well, if you feel the need to schedule another consultation with me, feel free to do that through Peter. You can also get a hold of me directly, actually, and I'll just tell Peter that it's happening, so he knows he's aware of that. And yeah, I mean, I look forward to like I said, I'm glad that you're in the community. I look forward to speaking to you soon. If again you have any questions that need to be answered again. So yeah.
Thanks a lot.